Good afternoon and welcome to this panel titled Weapons Sales in the Middle East, Economics, Priorities, and Human Cost. My name is Yara. I am an assistant professor at the University of Central Florida and a non-resident fellow here at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. I have the honor of sharing the screen with a very impressive group of experts who will discuss trends in international arms transfer and weapons exports to the region and the role of the US, Russia, and China. This is a topic that has been especially in the news lately due to the ongoing situation in Afghanistan and some criticisms about arms sales to Egypt. Our panelists today will try to answer questions about the objectives and priorities of arms exporters to the region, the humanitarian dimension and the human costs of weapons sales, US policies and regulations tied to arms sales, and policy recommendations for the Biden administration. So I will briefly introduce today's panelists in speaking order. So first we'll have Alexandra Kuimova, a researcher with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's Arms and Military Expenditure Program. Her research and extensive publications focus on defense policies, monitoring arms transfers, arms procurement, and military expenditure in the MENA region and post-Soviet states, and Russian arms exports to the MENA region. Charles W. Dunne is a non-resident fellow at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Before joining ACW, Charles served as a U.S. diplomat for 24 years and was the director of Middle East and North Africa programs at Freedom House. His research and expertise centers on U.S. foreign policy, democracy and human rights, and regional security. Next, we have Shana Marshall, an assistant research professor of international affairs and the associate director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Her areas of expertise include Middle East political economy, global weapons trade, and corruption. Her current research focuses on patterns of military entrepreneurship in Egypt, Jordan, and the United Arab Emirates. And our last speaker today will be Rachel Stohl, the Vice President of Research Programs and Director of the Conventional Defense Program at the Stimson Center, and an adjunct professor in the Security Studies Program at Georgetown University. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, Stohl was an associate fellow at Chatham House at the Royal Institute of International Affairs and a senior analyst at the Center for Defense Information. So many thanks to these wonderful panelists for taking the time to join us today. Before I turn to our speakers for their remarks, I'd just like to remind the audience, please submit your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, or you can also email events@arabcenterdc.org. So I will now hand it off to Alexandra to start our panel. And Alexandra, the microphone is yours.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. First of all, I would like to say again, thank you for this kind invitation, and it is an honor for me to be part of this important panel discussion. I will start my presentation, my remarks, with providing a concise overview of trends in arms transfers in the Middle East and North Africa, and then I will speak about the role of Russia in the region as one of the largest arms suppliers. In my presentation, all statistics will be based on data on arms imports and exports that we at CIPRI collect, verify, analyze for our CIPRI arms transfer database. And as the volume of deliveries can fluctuate significantly year on year, I will present and compare data for 5-year periods in order to give you a more stable measure of trends. So what we can observe by looking at arms transfers and military expenditure data in the Middle East and North Africa countries is that the region is undergoing and has been undergoing rapid militarization, with nearly all MENA states directly or indirectly involved in regional conflicts, while simultaneously accumulating major arms. The volumes of major arms imports in the region have grown significantly over the last decade, illustrating the importance given to military capabilities by the MENA states. Arms imports by states in the Middle East and North Africa were 23% higher in 2016-20 than in 2011-2015. So as I mentioned, I will provide trends in comparing 5-year periods. And according to our data, 5 of the top 10 arms importing states in 2016-20 were in the Middle East and North Africa. And these are Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Algeria, Qatar, and the UAE. Altogether, these states accounted for almost 30% of total volumes of arms imports in the world. And I think this number is quite substantial. Almost all these states increased its arms imports between these two periods of times, 2011, 2015, and 2016-20, by more than 60%, with the exception of the UAE, which arms imports fell over the period. Overall, the MENA region accounted for 38% of the global arms imports in 2016-20, while in 11-15, the region accounted for 31%. States in the region received a high number of weapons from several large arms suppliers, including the United States, Russia, several European states, and China. So in 2016-20, or the last 5-year period, the USA was the largest exporter of arms in the region, accounting for 47% of all arms imports to the Middle East and North Africa, while Russia supplied 19%. France was the third largest arms supplier, and I will also say a couple of words about China since we're going to discuss it today. China accounted for only 2% of all imports to the Middle East and North Africa. However, I will also mention later that it wants to develop further cooperation with the states. But what does the data shows us if we look at the volume of exports by these states? So I talked about imports, the importer side, but what can you say about exports? So the question to be answered is whether the MENA region is prioritized by arms exporters as one of the main arms markets. And the answer is quite simple. Yes, it is by several arms suppliers. So for example, almost half of the US arms exports went to the Middle East and North Africa. In 2016-20, MENA accounted for 15% of Chinese total arms exports. And as for Russia, now it's time to talk about Russia. So as for Russia, the Middle East and North Africa is the second most important and growing foreign market for Russian arms sales after Asia and Oceania. In 2016-20, it accounted for 36% of all Russian exports. Algeria and Egypt were the largest recipients of Russian arms in the region, accounting for 15% and 12% of Russian exports in 2016-20, respectively. Moreover, Russian arms exports to these states increased significantly over the last decade. I will not tell you the percentages because I think you're already quite lost with the numbers. Speaking of Russia, arms exports have traditionally been a core element of Russia's cooperation strategy with the Middle East and North Africa. Arms sales to the region support Russia's political and security interests and play a quite important role in Russia's economy. And I said quite important, not super significant, because energy resources sector still dominates in terms of income. But if we talk about manufactured products or products manufactured for exports, then of course arms industry plays quite important role here. And at the same time, if we talk about the MENA countries, acquiring arms from Russia allows them to diversify their sources of arms supply and obviously become less dependent on Western suppliers. This of course enables and encourages Russia to compete with other established arms suppliers in the region. Arms exports are also a tool of Russia's broader foreign policy, which allows Russia to build and strengthen long-term relationships, and thus create dependencies, because as we know, arms deals involves maintenance of weapons and training of weapon operators. So therefore, it's a long-term relationship commitment in a way. And by doing this, Russia wants to promote itself as a reliable partner to the MENA states, often more appealing than countries in the West. But I should also mention that this is not new, this is not a novelty, as several major powers in the region, including the United States, are using arms transfers as a foreign policy tool to increase its presence and influence in the Middle East and North Africa region. So by developing political and economic ties with the majority of states, Russia is willing to strengthen its political influence in the region, strengthen its economy, and further develop economic cooperation with states in the region beyond arms sales. Another objective or another driver behind Russia's arms exports to the region probably should be also mentioned. It's the shared threat perception, such as terrorist threats. So sometimes Russia, similarly to the United States, can explain exports to the region by securing regional stability. So at the same time, many countries themselves do look towards Russia when it comes to arms procurement. As I already mentioned, they can diversify sources of weapons, but at the same time, Russian arms sales come with fewer political conditions compared to the US or some of the Western arms suppliers such as France or Germany. To illustrate this complex supplier-recipient relationships, let me just discuss one concrete example, also for the audience, just to understand a little bit what is happening. So I want to use Egypt as an example. So Egypt is the world's largest importer of major arms, and Egypt invested heavily in modernizing its armed forces recently. But what changed recently, especially after 2013, is that before the US used to be the largest arms supplier to Egypt, but after the military coup in 2013, when the US administration decided to cut substantial military aid to Egypt and delay planned deliveries of military equipment to Egypt, Russia decided to offer Egypt its, wouldn't say help, but arms that Egypt was looking for. And the soaring of relationship between Egypt and the US was a driving factor for strengthening the relationship between Egypt and Russia. And just to mention that Russia was quick enough to confirm its willingness, and that's what Egypt actually liked, because Egypt really wanted certain types of weapons. And even though after some time, US decided to still continue providing military aid to Egypt, that was a turning point, in my view, between Egypt and Russia's relationships. So Russia and Egypt signed many arms deals, including for procurement, combat aircraft, combat helicopters, air defense systems. And one of the latest interesting deals is the deal for procurement of Russia's fighter jets, Su-35. This actually gained widespread attention recently, especially with regard to CAATSA sanctions and other aspects of this deal. So what we can observe now is that Russia emerged as the largest supplier of major arms to Egypt, and relations between Russia and Egypt currently go beyond arms sales and have recently reached a new level of cooperation in other areas, in investment, in I should probably also mention military exercises and develop a nuclear power plant. So now the relationship goes much beyond than it was a couple of years ago. So it was an example I wanted to show how Russia uses arms sales as the way to strengthen its relationships with countries in the region. And it is important to highlight as well that Russia's objectives in the MENA region is a part of Russia's so-called grand strategy more broadly, because in addition to the Middle East and North Africa, Russia is willing to continue to develop relationship with Asia and increase cooperation in states in Africa, for example. Africa, I think it's another platform for competition between Russia, US, and Western suppliers, and continue to build military cooperation with several states of former Soviet Union to raise its international status and consolidate its role as an important player and military actor. So I thought this is important to highlight that, yes, Russia is interested in the Middle East and North Africa, but at the same time is still looking around to develop relationship with other regions. And I think I will stop now. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was a great, I think, introduction to the topic, and really will lead us nicely into the remaining panelists. I want to remind everyone, please submit your questions either via the Q&A or via email. And let's move on to our next panelist, Charles Dunne.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the Arab Center for hosting this very important panel, which I think is becoming an increasing issue as we determine what Middle East policy should be going forward over the next few years of the Biden administration. So I would like to start by asking, what is the strategic rationale for U.S. arms sales to the Middle East, which, as Alexandra pointed out, absorb nearly half of global U.S. arms exports? Now, Dana Stohl, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Middle East at the Department of Defense, put it pretty succinctly in congressional testimony last month. And she said that U.S. arms transfers to the Middle East are part of an overall security cooperation framework, which is aimed at building self-reliant, capable, and accountable partner forces who work alongside the United States to achieve mutual objectives based on a shared view of the threats to regional stability and security. Now, the assumptions built into this strategy are important if we're going to evaluate how effective the strategy has been. So what are these assumptions? And I have about 6 of them, and I'd like to list kind of briefly. First of all, the first assumption is that arms transfers, in addition to other forms of security cooperation, will protect American interests by enhancing partners' abilities to defeat and defend internal and external threats, especially transnational terrorist threats. The second is that arms transfers and training will help deter Iran, which the US sees as perhaps the most important destabilizing factor in the region of the Middle East. Third, arms transfers will enhance the ability of regional states to cooperate on a multilateral basis, work together on shared security concerns. This is important, largely independent of the United States. That's the aim and the assumption. Number 4, which is not as frequently stated up front, but is nevertheless critically important, is that arms sales and transfers buy influence and clout with governments in the region, which enables key regional goals. Examples of this are, of course, the Egypt assistance program, where arms transfers are not only supposed to undergird Arab-Israeli peace, Egyptian-Israeli peace, but they're supposed to make Egypt a strong, capable partner of the U.S. on many security issues, including counterterrorism. And of course, sale of the F-35s to the UAE was an important factor in encouraging the signing of the Abraham Accords under the Trump administration. Number 5 is that arms transfers will enhance regional stability by edging out Russia and China. Now, Dana Stohl in her testimony openly acknowledged this, as has General Frank McKenzie, the commander of CENTCOM. They are a major tool to push Russia and China to the sidelines. And finally, number 6, and this is an assumption that Dana kind of got at in her testimony too, recipients of US arms will be accountable for the responsible US use of the arms that we provide. And they'll be made responsible through exposure to US values, and this will be inculcated through training, through adherence to the laws on arms transfers, and so on. So you take a look at the strategic rationale for our arms sales, and you have to ask the question, whether they have actually worked to achieve these objectives. In other words, what have they actually accomplished in the real world, how effective they have been? And I would say that there is ample reason for doubt, having dealt with this issue for a number of years. US arms sale to Saudi Arabia, for example, they haven't done much to promote regional security, as the war in Yemen demonstrated quite clearly. And US arms are arguably not only prolonged the war, but has made the humanitarian crisis that much worse. The provision of US arms to Egypt has resulted in a number of things, including enriching the Egyptian military complex, but it's also enabled them to pursue a rather heavy-handed and largely secret campaign of counterterrorism in Sinai against an ISIS affiliate, which has reportedly had very heavy costs for the civilian population there. And of course, US arms have helped the UAE and others intervene directly in Libya, often in contravention of US policy goals towards that country. Take a look at Iran. deterring Iran from regional adventurism is an important goal of US arms transfer policy. And has that worked? Well, arguably, no. US support of Saudi Arabia not only enabled the campaign to be prolonged, but it helped open the door to greater Iranian involvement in Yemen. Iranian adventurism is alive and well in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. And of course, the presence of major US weapon systems such as the Patriot haven't really prevented Iran from launching an occasional attack, such as the 2019 drone and missile strike on a major Saudi oil facility. So, I would argue that at least in terms of deterring Iran or preventing Iran's regional destabilizing activities, it hasn't really worked all that well. And of course, the Russians and Chinese haven't been deterred either. As Alexandra pointed out, the Russians are very active in their arms trade. In fact, they're selling arms to most American regional partners. And both Russia and China, who is also, of course, an arms supplier on a much lower scale, are continuing to score economic and political deals as well. And if you're looking at the strategy of arms transfers in terms of have we created more self-reliant US partners, I think the answer has to be no. We have not built up any of the Arab militaries that we deal with to the point that they can cooperate multilaterally on an issue of mutual security concern without substantial American assistance, especially lift capacity and resupply and the like. And this leaves entirely aside as to whether regional partners are willing to cooperate with one another, which is another story altogether. And it seems to me the part of the problem here is that the Arab militaries to whom we sell many of our weapon systems are generally speaking looking for the most modern, most expensive, most visible types of weapon systems, often at the expense of their real defensive needs, which usually center on more basic counterterrorism and border control equipment. But those don't enhance the prestige of militaries and governments nearly as much as, say, the F-35s will. And that has been a real problem in Arab procurement. And the fact that the United States has been not that successful in pushing back against that, although it has been trying for a number of years, is kind of an indicator of how little success we've had in this particular goal. In terms of influence, I don't believe that US arms sales to the region have bought influence with the governments, or at least not nearly enough influence to counter the troubling domestic and international behaviors of some of our friends and allies in the region. In fact, it seems to me the influence often runs the other way. US arms exporters become dependent on the Middle East market, and continued arms sales to a number of these governments creates a sense of obligation, security obligations, political obligations to the recipient governments on the part of the US military and the US political administration. And governments in the region have been able to leverage this sense of obligation and dependence to manipulate US policy in many instances by threatening to withhold cooperation on certain issues unless their needs are served. So I do not believe that we have created access to the leaderships for certain with our arms sales. We've created access to bases, overflight clearances in many cases, especially with Egypt. But in terms of real political influence, it's been quite limited. Now, and I'm sure the other speakers are going to touch on this too, but I'd just like to mention it briefly. What arming repressive states in the region has accomplished, however, is help make these regimes more confident and capable in the repression of their own citizens. We have seen from the wave of authoritarian repression since the Arab Spring uprisings of 10 years ago. And it's also, and this is really critical, created a web of patronage and corruption that has enhanced regime and military power, not only at the expense of citizens, but at the expense of transparency and accountability, all of which runs counter to stated US goals for its arms transfers policy in the Middle East. Now, This being the case, why isn't there more pressure to reevaluate and redefine U.S. arms transfers policy to the Middle East? And to my mind, in a nutshell, it comes down to money, politics, and inertia. Let me explain what I mean. It seems to me that arms sales are increasingly divorced from a meaningful strategic rationale. Instead, they justify themselves by virtue of the profits they generate and the other economic activity that goes in its wake. And this comes not just, of course, from the hardware sales, but from the extensive logistics train that tails in its wake, which includes provision of spare parts, training, maintenance, and so on, employing thousands of American citizens. And it integrates recipients of American arms into the logistical chain of the US military, which is very, very difficult to disentangle. Moreover, a lot of this work, in fact, the bulk of this work, defense production, is distributed by defense companies to as many congressional districts as possible. So this creates a huge amount of buy-in on arms sales from Congress and support for the diplomatic policies that the arms sales are supposed to undergird. And that makes it even more difficult to change. In addition, and this should be mentioned, the kind of revolving door of DoD personnel, ex-congressmen, congressional aides from government service into the private sector, where they often go to work lobbying for the Middle East states who import substantial quantities of arms, really constitutes an industry in itself, both of money and of influence. And it's a major factor in keeping this whole perpetual motion machine going. I mentioned inertia, and here's what I mean by that. It seems to me that the national security justifications that we just discussed for continued arms transfers have become basically received wisdom over many, many years, just through sheer force of repetition, even if they're out of date. You know, for example, the State Department talking points on why we supply security assistance to Egypt and have since 1979 have rarely changed in the last 20 years. And I know because I used to write these 20 years ago as political military officer in the embassy in Cairo. Circumstances and Egypt's relative clout in the region have certainly changed, but the rationale for why we continue to provide this has not. And that's what I mean by inertia. Now, if such circumstances, justifications are in some ways a fiction, at least they're an agreed upon a fiction between US administrations and diplomats and the countries that they deal with. To question these assumptions is seen as radical and destabilizing, not only by the military industrial complex that benefits from the arms sales, but by the countries who receive these weapons. So really the path of least resistance is the safest. By not questioning the rationales for these arms sales and continuing to do business as usual, US diplomats can avoid ruffling feathers and keep the relationship as smooth as possible, which is usually the goal of our relationships with most of these countries, if I allowed a little bit of cynicism there. Now, the Biden administration has indicated that it plans some major shifts in the way it prioritizes arms sales to the region, emphasizing human rights and emphasizing defensive weapons. And they did do a pause in arms sales to the region very briefly at the beginning to reevaluate. But the early decisions that came out of this are cause for some concern. The administration proceeded with a $23 billion arms sale to the UAE, including the F-35 fighters. It gave $197 billion or $197 million in a missile deal to Egypt, despite human rights concerns. And of course, just yesterday, after a lot of dithering for a period of months, the US released the bulk of $300 million in military assistance to Egypt, which had been held up by human rights concerns. And I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A period. So let me just wrap up here. How much change then can we really expect from the Biden administration in terms of arms sales policy? I think that remains very much to be seen. And I'd only point out that over the last 12 years, there's been remarkable consistency in what the US does overall in terms of arms sales. Foreign arms sales under Trump amounted to about $57 billion per year in 2020 dollars, as opposed to about $53.9 billion under the 8 years of President Obama. So it might be unwise to expect too much of a shift in overall arms sales, and certainly arms sales to the Middle East under Biden. And let me just make this last point here. I think there's a good possibility that arms sales to the region could accelerate under Biden if he's really serious about it, transferring military and diplomatic attention to the Indo-Pacific region. That requires strong and capable partners to maintain some kind of stability regime. And that in turn, by the logic of the United States' own regional security strategy, would likely depend on accelerated arms sales to the region to expand their capabilities to deter Iran and enforce such a regime of stability. Time will tell, but I think that would be the direction it would most likely trend in. So with a new administration in place, the withdrawal from Afghanistan complete, we're now in a time of really extraordinary flux, and I would say an extraordinary opportunity to take a much closer look at our assumptions and our general rationale for arms sales to the Middle East, and to adjust them to some of these new realities accordingly. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charles. I really enjoyed that framing of the assumptions because it makes it quite clear how often they bump up against the realities that we're seeing in the region. I'd like to turn next to our next speaker, Shana Marshall.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. I'd like to, for people interested in these topics, direct them to a few really great resources, one of which is the Middle East Research and Information Project, which is a 50-year-old magazine covering the region, available at marip.org. It's all open source and has a lot of great information on the history of arms transfers and weapons sales to the region, as well as a newer project called the Security in Context Project that also confronts a lot of these issues. Somewhat conveniently, Brown University's very well-known Costs of War project just this month updated its post 9/11 tallies on the costs of US wars since 9/11, which now amounts to $14 trillion, a third of which, or even one half of which, went to private military and security contractors, and also updated the human toll of direct war deaths, meaning those who were directly killed in bombings and other military actions, to almost 1 million. That doesn't include, of course, those who died of all of the secondary effects of war, such as war-related disease, the destruction of critical infrastructure, which causes inadequate access to water or sewage treatment systems, suicide, refugees who died in the process of fleeing war zones, and the poverty and dislocation that are exacerbated by conflict. Nor does it include those who were seriously maimed. So if we include those tallies, the figure grows into the many, many millions. A key component of those secondary effects that will only increase with time is the death toll from poisoning and destruction of the environment from toxic weapons materials like depleted uranium. Increased incidence of cancer and serious birth defects in Iraq, for example, come from the use of anti-tank weapons that contain depleted uranium, which is a radioactive material that's used to coat munitions so that they can pierce tank armor. The pulverizing of infrastructure during air bombing campaigns, such as that carried out against Yemen, produces what researchers refer to as conflict rubble, which has similarly devastating impacts on health. This rubble dust contains cement, metals, PCBs, or polychlorinated biphenyls, which are highly toxic substances used in industrial applications in buildings, as well as silica, asbestos, and other synthetic fibers, all of which cause devastating respiratory diseases and cancers. In addition to their direct health effects from imminent exposure, these materials poison water sources and agricultural land, which lead to additional death and disease from contamination and starvation. All this carnage is due to ordinary conventional weapons, of course, that are produced not just in the US, Russia, and Europe. Those are the military industrial core countries, but increasingly in other countries as well. Many of the most productive secondary producers of weapon systems are those whose arms industries were subsidized with major funding and technology transfer from the US. In the Middle East and North Africa, this includes the cases of Israel, Turkey, Iraq in the 1980s, and then again after 2003, Iran under the Shah, post-Nasser Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf states, primarily Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, all of which have been the recipients of enormous support from the US arms industry, either through financing, technology support, or both. US doctrine in the latter half of the 20th century promoted the growth of regional militaries and their weapons systems as a sort of proxy for US interests in the region, which has created a legacy of highly weaponized governments with disproportionately large rates of military spending in relation to overall government spending. As the capacity of the US imperial presence in the region has noticeably weakened, of course, these countries have expanded their own efforts to develop indigenous weapons industries, often through partnerships with other foreign suppliers from China, Eastern Europe, and South Africa, as well as through intra-regional partnerships that join Gulf financing with the existing military industrial capacities of countries like Egypt, Jordan, and Algeria. These efforts are often rhetorically framed less in geostrategic terms and more as efforts to diversify economic activities and to industrialize their economies, especially in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Here, the history of the US and Europe is very instructive, where a century of state-subsidized military industrial activity was promoted as the foundation of advances in civilian technology and economic growth. It also reflects the increasing focus on high-cost technologies in the development of new weapon systems, including things like machine learning or AI for weapons and intelligence applications, which fits particularly well with the Gulf economies because of their capacity to provide high levels of financing to their own domestic firms. The fact that most multinational military producers and large service providers now have a significant executive presence as well as increased R&D facilities in the Gulf is no coincidence, because they see these states as the future of markets for their products and as sites for future assembly, development of new systems, and as bases for sales to the rest of the world. Supply chains for major weapon systems are already quite dispersed, with components for many US systems coming from places like China, as well as from sweatshop-style maquiladores factories in Mexico along the US border. Outsourcing weapons production in this way not only reduces prices for the private firms that build weapons, but also creates new political constituencies to support the continued production and the continued state subsidizing of weapons systems. It further weakens efforts to control the proliferation of weapons, as well as all but the most advanced systems are assembled and marketed in more and more countries. This is why we should really examine the military-industrial complex as a global actor and as a quintessentially capitalist actor, rather than as a domestic or a nationalist industry that is subject to the political control of a single country. Perhaps the most visible illustration of this reality is the funding that comes from the weapons industry that goes to think tanks and consulting firms to consistently support the expanded provision of arms transfers, new weapons technologies, and related training to pretty much every corner of the globe, and to provide expert analysis to argue in favor or to argue against even the most modest controls over weapons exports. One would be very hard-pressed, in fact, to find any think tank in Washington that is consistently arguing in favor of enhanced export controls. This was not necessarily always the case, as during the Cold War, there were initiatives in the US that focused on the control of the spread of conventional weapons. But the interregnum between the fall of the Soviet Union and 9/11 was a period of declining profits for the military-industrial complex, which responded by spending large sums lobbying against these arms control initiatives and against the continued funding of agencies that focused on arms control and disarmament. So all we're now left with is organizations that focus overwhelmingly on the control of non-conventional weapon systems such as nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, despite the fact that conventional weapons are the ones responsible for the vast majority of death and destruction. And as we have seen very clearly in the history of US interventions in the Middle East and elsewhere, very easily wind up in places far from their original point of shipment. But unlike non-conventional weapons, conventional systems like tanks, guns, and missiles are part of a highly profitable and incredibly influential private sector industry. The increased spread of the production and development of conventional weapon systems, of course, has a direct impact on the strength and influence of the domestic military establishment, which is very visible in cases like Egypt, as well as increasingly in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, where inter-regional military interventions are increasing. The parallel proliferation of facilities for housing and maintaining these weapon systems, as well as military bases and platforms for deploying these weapon systems itself, creates new incentives for war, as has been demonstrated empirically in scholarship on the United States and its 800 overseas military bases and the presence of its troops in over 100 countries. Essentially, the presence of vast military resources increases the likelihood of using military solutions to solve problems instead of relying on diplomatic efforts. The last point that I'd like to make is one that's not often taken into account in geostrategic conversations, but this is the costs to the US of maintaining a globalized military presence and the world's largest military industrial complex. $14 trillion is not a meager figure. And although we're essentially borrowing a lot of this money through issuing treasury securities to countries like China and Saudi Arabia, the political costs of that spending in the US have been enormous. Our health and public education infrastructure in the US has been starved of funds, as have other critical priorities like adapting to climate change. So the cost of weapons production is really very much a global phenomenon that has discrete winners and losers. And there are also many losers to that here in the US, primarily among the working class and the poor, who bear the burden of the decline of the US social safety net and the public services that is necessitated by these enormous levels of spending on war and weapons.
Thank you, Shana. I'm glad you touched on those indirect outcomes, like health ailments, cancer coming years later. We need to include those in the costs of war, right? And I think you also really captured the complexity of just how many issues are wrapped up in arms sales, from globalization, climate change, and even domestic poverty. So I'm going to move to our last speaker. I already see some really interesting questions in the Q&A. So if you have any questions, please submit them via Zoom, or you can email events@arabcenterdc.org. And now I will turn to our last speaker, Rachel Stohl.
Thanks, Yara. Thanks to the Arab Center Washington for this opportunity. And I just want to thank my fellow panelists. There's always benefits and costs to going last. The benefit of this presentation is certainly that I got to hear such interesting information from all of you and really put what I have to say into some context. I think what I'll do is focus around my remarks around how the United States has played a role in arms exports to the Middle East, how that role sort of devolved a little bit under the Trump administration, and then finish with some steps that the Biden administration can take to chart what I would say is a more responsible course, and perhaps not just in the region, but around the world. So Alexandra gave us a really strong background and sort of the data around the arms trade to the Middle East region. We know that the United States has a dominant share of that market, and not just in the Middle East, but really the US leads as the global arms exporter for decades. That market dominance has really only increased in the past several years. And I would say, just to Charles's point, that the sales are continuing unabated, despite the Biden administration's commitments to human rights and changing the way that arms transfers have been handled. And I know they have a new conventional arms transfer policy that will be released shortly that will guide sort of the focus of our transfers. But I would say that what we are seeing so far demonstrates that perhaps is more rhetoric than actual deeds. Just this week, as was mentioned, the administration decided to provide $170 million in military aid to Egypt, ostensibly for counterterrorism, border security, and nonproliferation. Those are all great words. Additional $130 million was promised as well on the condition that Egypt ends prosecutions against civil society organizations and drops charges against 16 individuals. All $300 million in assistance was conditioned on human rights benchmarks by Congress, which the administration has now evaded by using a vague and previously unused provision of law. Egypt isn't alone. As of January this year, the US had a staggering $126.6 billion in active government-to-government arms sales cases with Saudi Arabia, on top of billions of dollars worth of previously authorized commercial sales. These are not insignificant weapon systems that have been promised. The United States and Qatar have enjoyed a lucrative and extensive defense relationship for more than 25 years. The State Department has over $26 billion in active government-to-government arms sales with Qatar as of July this year, making it the US's second largest foreign military sales partner in the world. Has already authorized the export of over $2.8 billion in defense articles via the direct commercial sales process since 2016. So again, another major recipient of US weapons. The UAE is also set to receive advanced weapons. In November 2020, the State Department notified Congress of a proposed $23 billion arms deal with the UAE, consisting up to, this is the sale Charles mentioned, 50 F-35s, up to 18 MQ-9B Reaper drones, a package of air-to-air ground munitions. We saw lawmakers introduce resolutions of disapproval to block the sale due to human rights and diversion concerns, although the Senate failed to pass that law. The agreement was reportedly finalized just hours before President Biden's inauguration. Biden did temporarily freeze and initiate a review of the sale within his first week in office, but the State Department has confirmed since that it planned to move forward with the sales as of April 2021. Now, there is a lawsuit that was filed in December by the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs to block the sale. That lawsuit is ongoing, but again, another multi-billion-dollar sale. Security cooperation, including arms sales with Israel, has been an enduring feature of foreign policy for decades. I know sometimes that seems untouchable in various forums, but we can't leave Israel off the table when we're talking about arms sales to the region because of the geopolitics that goes into play with arms sales to that particular country. There are $23.2 billion worth of active foreign military sales cases with Israel as of July 2021. And the US has also sold or provided financing for billions of dollars worth of additional arms sales over the past few years. Each of these importers, like many of the top recipients of US weapons and equipment in the region, have appalling human rights records. And unsurprisingly, US arms exports to the region are routinely used in the commission of human rights abuses, war crimes, and other violations. We often, as was mentioned, think of Yemen as the easiest example of these abuses, where Saudi Arabia and its coalition partners have relied on US weapons and equipment to wage a brutal offensive that has killed at least 18,000 Yemeni civilians and spawned arguably one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And it's really hard, I want to just emphasize this, to overstate the role US arms sales have played in stoking that conflict. Between 2016 and 2020, arms sales to Saudi Arabia represented nearly a quarter of all of US arms exports and made up 79% of Saudi Arabia's arms imports. They could not wage that conflict without the United States. So sort of to the points that a lot of our speakers or presenters were making, we recognize there are devastating consequences that US arms sales to the region have had, but the US continues to arm these Middle East countries. Charles mentioned these sales are motivated in part by concern that regional actors, including terrorist and insurgent groups, and increasingly Iran, pose a growing threat to the United States and its interests in the region. By arming our partners and allies in the region, we can help keep those threats at bay while minimizing direct US involvement. But I think we also have to recognize that the influx of US weapons and equipment is also driven by political and economic competition. Allowing weapons to flow largely unimpeded to the region, even to some of the world's worst human rights abusers, opens the door for the US to compete directly with Russia and China, as Alexandra mentioned, but also with Iran for political influence and for a share of an increasingly crowded global arms market. So while the US has a long history, this is not something new, of flooding the Middle East with weapons and equipment, often with devastating consequences, things took a significant turn for the worse under the Trump administration. Both as a matter of policy and practice, the Trump administration placed an outsized importance on the perceived economic benefit of arms sales to the Middle East at the expense of other foreign policy or security concerns. And this contributed really to a largely transactional US approach to arms sales to the region, one in which arms sales were justified based on the jobs they would supposedly create or the economic gain they would provide. While lawmakers in the House and Senate mounted considerable opposition to delay or block a number of the Trump administration's Middle East arms deals, based at least in part on the very real risk of US weapons being diverted or misused, the administration was able to use a combination of legislative loopholes and vetoes to overcome them. Now, turning to the Biden administration, in some ways, the Biden administration has been worse. The Trump administration was quite clear in its use of arms sales as a business transaction and for short-sighted economic gain. But the Biden administration has claimed it would distinguish itself from Trump's arms sales policy and place human rights considerations front and center. And I just want to remind you of words that President Biden himself said during the campaign. He said, "I would end US support for the disastrous Saudi-led war in Yemen. We will make clear that America will never again check its principles at the door just to buy oil or sell weapons." However, in practice, that is not what we are seeing. In the recent decisions by the Biden administration to allow arms sales to the Middle East, particularly to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, are really a betrayal of the promised primacy of human rights. You can't say that human rights is a central pillar of foreign policy and continue to sell arms to countries that continue to abuse their own citizens and innocent civilians abroad. I don't buy it. It doesn't work. So what do? I really do believe President Biden has an opportunity to reassess and reimagine the US approach to arms sales in the region and around the world. This isn't just a policy that should be adopted for the Middle East. This really should be the entire approach of the Biden administration towards arms sales writ large. We should be promoting responsibility, mitigate harm, and strengthen international laws and norms. And so there's 4 recommendations I want to quickly mention here. First, the easiest, do not move forward with harmful Trump-era arms sales that are still in the pipeline, and reconsider those that have been approved in the first few months of this administration. I guess we're at like 10 months now. I can't really say it's the first few months anymore, but really reflect on those decisions that have been made. Soon after he took office, President Biden initiated a pause and review of several of these Middle East arms sales. In addition to that Egypt sale that was announced, the sale of precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia and more than $23 billion in jets, drones, and munitions to the UAE were paused, but the administration has since confirmed that those are almost all of those will be going through. Given the devastating impact that we know that US made weapons and equipment have already had in the region, and the very real likelihood that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt will continue to use US support to commit further atrocities, it would be an enormous mistake to allow these pending sales to proceed. Second, as it considers how it handles Middle East arms sales already in the pipeline and whether to pursue any additional sales, the Biden administration needs to work collaboratively with Congress to afford them a meaningful role in the process. While the congressional attempts to block US-Saudi arms sales under President Trump failed, they were nonetheless remarkable achievements. First of all, we were talking about them, which in and of itself is magnificent, but they were rare and nearly unprecedented displays of bipartisan disapproval from Congress in response to proposed arms sales, particularly to a close ally. Congress seldom critiques proposed arms sales so publicly. And with these votes, a growing number of lawmakers have indicated that they will no longer accept business as usual in providing US weapons to close allies. And it's not just a role for the administration. We should have the administration and Congress working together. And President Biden, who himself was a former senator, should welcome the eagerness to reassert Congress's role in national security and foreign policy decision-making instead of trying to cut them out, as President Trump did when he used an emergency exception to push through an arms sale without the customary congressional notification period. So the Biden administration can afford lawmakers ample opportunity to review and weigh in on proposed sales as they are required to under law. And if and when they do have an objection based on a legitimate security or foreign policy reason, the administration should work to address their concerns, even if it means modifying or abandoning a sale. There's also proposed legislation that Congress could flip the script and develop assistance that requires congressional affirmation for a select set of sales rather than disapproval. Disapproval is a very high bar, but approval could be something that moves things more quickly. And then lastly, the Biden administration should reinvigorate US leadership on conventional arms issues around the globe and reinforce shared commitments with partners and allies. The easiest step is for the US to re-engage in the arms trade treaty process. The Trump administration had unsigned, which isn't really actually a thing you can do, but claimed it was unsigning the treaty. And in the Biden administration should actually reassert that the United States upholds the values and principles for a more responsible arms trade. There's really a lot of work that needs to be done to enhance the laws, policies, and practices surrounding US arms sales and to prevent US weapons and equipment from fueling further violations and instability in the Middle East. Fortunately, there continues to be a real appetite for change, both on the part of the American public, the many lawmakers and administration officials, the dedicated civil society that is quite vocal in its opposition to many of these sales and for promoting more responsible arms transfers. Only time's going to tell how serious the Biden administration is in implementing these and other reforms. And as we near the end of Biden's first year in office, I just want to say the clock is ticking and we are watching. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel. You're pointing out that so many of these arms, including and especially those sold by the U.S., are used to accelerate, some of the worst human rights abuses that we witness. And I think this is really important to mention in any meaningful discussion of global arms. And I think you made that point very powerfully. So thank you. So I see we have some really great questions here. We will try to get through as many as possible. So let me start with, we have a question here that I believe essentially it is, we spend a lot of time talking about these open conflicts, Israel, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. What do we do, or what can we say about how over-weaponization, militarization in the region is exacerbating these kind of, cold conflicts? They're not open war quite yet. And this person points to the example of Morocco and Algeria. Does anyone want to touch on that? Just go ahead and unmute.
Maybe I can start the conversation. Yeah, I think it is super important to talk about arms exports and imports in general, especially in the regions where the potential conflict exists. And in this regard, Algeria and Morocco is one of the countries we should always keep in mind when we talk about militarization. So Algeria is one of the largest arms importers in the world, and also it spends quite a lot of money on military expenditure. So Russia exported so many weapon systems to Algeria over the last decades, but also the US exported a lot of weapons to Morocco. So this is something we need to keep in mind, that this export can be used in a very, very negative way, of course, because we have an example of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Similarly, Turkey and Russia was exporting weapons to both sides, and nobody was expecting the conflict to be escalated so fast. But then it happened. So, and all these weapons exported to these countries over the last decade were used during the conflict, and especially, and the consequences was horrible, especially with regards to human losses. So same situation can happen in Algeria and Morocco, unfortunately. So therefore, my goal, I think, as a researcher, is to provide this data to civil societies, to policymakers, so they can see what is happening in the countries with regard to arms exports, and then use this information in order to prevent conflict in these countries.
Yeah, could I just add to this that, it seems to me that, as I kind of alluded to, the export of arms to a lot of countries creates a sense of obligation a political obligation as well as military obligation to some of these countries. So even in a cold conflict, countries such as Morocco and Algeria that are importing large quantities of weapons from their international patrons have a sense of backup, and the fact that they are prepared in this way to engage in a hot conflict kind of seems to me lessens the impetus for diplomatic solutions. So I mean that can sometimes result in a shooting conflict, but in other cases it can result in these countries digging in their heels. So in this sense, I would say that the arms sales have certainly not encouraged meaningful diplomatic progress to some of the interstate conflicts, especially involving North Africa.
Thank you. This next topic, we got 2 comments on, and partially they were directed to you, Rachel. So I'll start with you on this question. Do you think there's enough attention given to ethical considerations and the use of captive populations for research and development of arms and surveillance technology? And the examples given here are China and the Uyghur population, and Israel and the Palestinian population.
So I think the ethics in the arms trade is a whole area of research that obviously we were touching on, sort of the trade itself and the impact of the trade, but the ethics behind the decisions to trade are obviously quite significant, and the justifications or the reasons why particular arms sales go forward often are missing those ethical components. Whether it's, the populations that you mentioned, certainly there are numerous cases where weapons have been tested, not just conventional weapons, but nuclear, chemical, biological weapons have been tested on vulnerable populations, where we have seen cases of really horrific injuries, long-term trauma of particular populations. I think as we're thinking about the ethical use of weapons, the ethical trade in weapons, we have to think about risk mitigation. We have to undertake particular strategies, both as exporters and importers, to ensure that across the life cycle of those weapons, that the risk of both diversion and misuse, right? We often it's easier for governments to focus on diversion because then it's not their fault, right? That's not where we wanted the weapons to end up. But there's also this issue of misuse. Were they utilized how they were intended? No one ever on their letter of agreement or offer says, we expect you to use these against your own populations or to terrorize vulnerable civilians. That's never what it says, but there has to be efforts across the life cycle of those weapons to mitigate the risk that those weapons will do harm, not just in the short term, but in the long term as well.
And does anyone else want to add before we move to the next question?
I might. Just to touch on specifically the case of Israel, Palestine, captive populations are always, right, the population that is used sort of to test the development of new weapons or any kinds of new technologies, right? Because by their nature, they are essentially powerless, right? And it's recognized that those populations are easily dismissed and that they don't have sort of international standing. And so it's very easy to use them because they're obviously, in the sense that they're captive, they can't escape from that sort of testing laboratory. So this is something that's not just in weapon systems, but in testing all kinds of new technologies, and not just in that particular case of Israel, Palestine, but historically, also in many other cases for the deployment of new technologies and new forms of policing and everything else that sort of goes along with that. So that's an excellent question. And I think there's a lot of good research on that. But it's probably something that needs to be addressed more thoroughly.
Yeah, thank you, Shana. And I want to echo Shana's earlier recommendation to check out MARIP. It's a really great website and resource. So to our next question, all of you kind of talked about this global competition for arms sales and the many cynical reasons, used specifically in the Middle East. So we have a question here. Do you believe that with Russia and China offering stealth technology and drones, will this make the US more willing to offer these weapons platforms to the Middle East to be competitive in this way? Let's go Charles and then Shana.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. I believe, and in some cases we are selling drone technology in the region. And until and unless the Biden administration or any other administration decides to do a zero-based review of arms policy and what we intend to accomplish, which has to take in the side effects, again, not just the intended use of these things, but what are the potential humanitarian and human rights side effects of some of these technologies? I think it's going to be evaluated on the basis of how does it fit into our sense of competition with Russia and China? How does it fit into our political relationships with these countries? And the military considerations will be left aside. And economic considerations will be very important. So yes, I absolutely think that in addition to helping to spur an arms race in the Middle East, we're spurring a technology race in the Middle East, and I think drones would be a major focus of that. Again, barring some major adjustments in U.S. arms transfer policies.
I mean, this justification about, if we don't sell it to them, someone else is going to anyway, is always the justification that firms use and that their lobbyists in DC use to weaken export protocols. And they've been incredibly effective because there are really very few hard and fast export protocols that are still in place, even when the conditions would suggest overwhelmingly that additional controls and limitations need to be implemented. I mean, the carnage of all of the weapon systems that are proliferated throughout the region should be evidence enough that there need to be more firm controls in place. But it also works in their favor, in the favor of producers, because once that technology is proliferated sufficiently, then it allows them to argue for additional subsidies from the government to develop then next generation technologies that are superior to those technologies that are now proliferated everywhere. So it has its own built-in mechanism of encouraging subsidies to the defense industry in the first place, which is of course why they promote it as a geostrategic rationale, when in fact it's very much about commercial concerns.
Thank you. So building off of that idea that we have all heard, if we don't sell it to them, someone else will. What do we think about Russia or China potentially selling nuclear technology to the Gulf states? And this person points to a previous example of China selling nuclear capable weapons in the past to Saudi Arabia. And Alexandra, do you want to start us off with this?
Yes, sure. So I think when we talk about Russia's cooperation or potential sales of weapons to the Gulf countries, we should start with conventional weapons first, not talk about the nuclear technologies, because as we know that the Gulf market is dominated by the Western suppliers right now, and Russia is trying to climb its way towards being a large exporter to the Gulf countries. However, it hasn't succeeded yet. The only example probably is this sale that happened a couple of years ago when Russia actually managed to, for the first time, exported weapons to Saudi Arabia, and it was the first time ever when Russia actually supplied something, and it was the specialized rocket launchers that were delivered to Saudi Arabia. So I think when we talk about technologies transfer, I think we should start with conventional weapons first. So therefore, I cannot answer the question about nuclear technologies because, well, there is no that much cooperation at the moment at all. So, and but also again, Russia has its own understanding of weapon exports, and there is not so much civil oversight with regard to this. So I guess we will just see what will be happening with regards to arms supplies.
And does anyone want to follow up on that potential? Yeah, Charles.
Yeah, I would just say I don't see at the moment much of a potential for nuclear weapons technology being exported. Nuclear technology, yes. I mean, the Russians. I'm not sure about the Chinese, but the Russians have definitely been marketing their own nuclear technology in the region, which, you know, as we know, can, without serious safeguards, be potentially converted to a nuclear weapons program. I mean, the Saudis, for one, have been pretty clear in that if Iran obtains a nuclear weapon, they were going to follow suit, and various officials, both in and out of office, have stated that. So definitely the provision of nuclear technology to some of these governments should be cause for concern, but there are quite a few steps between that and actual provision of or creation of a indigenous nuclear weapons capability. But the whole nuclear supply chain really does need to be scrutinized as a national security issue, I think, by the United States.
Thank you. Our next question, I think, stays right in that area of the Gulf states. I think several of you mentioned the Gulf states forming an indigenous defense industry. So do we know, or what do we think about how far those states are from an indigenous defense industry comparable perhaps to that of Europe's?
I can speak on this a little bit. It's interesting, you know, for example, Saudi Arabia has been trying to develop this capability for decades, right? Since the mid to late 80s and 90s, when it had very large arms purchase agreements under the Peace Shield deal with the US and the Al Yamama sales with the UK. They had these reciprocal agreements where the US and the UK would export sort of production technologies to Saudi Arabia in order to establish factories that would produce things like cockpits for jet planes or other items like this. And it got, you know, in some cases, they did end up building these factories and they did end up sort of opening assembly lines. But then that was really halted because the government was very worried about sabotage by the workers in the actual factories, right? That they were going to actually, you know, build in some sort of inadequacies in the products that were then going to go into the weapon systems that would be used by the Saudi military. So to what extent they've sort of solved that issue, I'm not sure. I think the efforts of the Saudi government to sort of engage in regional sort of military adventurism and to sort of build up this sort of patriotic, like sort of jingoistic, very sort of nationalistic sort of fervor among the public is an effort to alleviate those concerns so that it can build up more of an indigenous defense industry. I mean, they're constantly talking about, you know, in Vision 2030, we expect to have 60, 70, 80% of our defense industrial needs produced domestically. I think that's probably very unrealistic, but at a very fundamental level, if they could supply their own sort of spare parts and munitions for the existing systems, the very large systems that they already have, right? The bombs that they need for the fighter jets or the missile replacements that they need for different systems, they could be much more sort of independent than they are right now. And the UAE, of course, is much more, I would say, further along because they have been much more comprehensive in their efforts to provide funding and technology inputs to their domestic firms, primarily by just purchasing sort of wholesale firms and factories from Europe and sort of transferring them to the UAE, and then also companies that exist in the US that focus on different military technologies, and then essentially just buying them out and transferring their operations to the UAE. So the fact that both countries have an enormous amount of sort of financial resources that they probably will much further along than if a country that didn't have significant financial resources was trying to do the same.
Thank you, Shana. And does anyone else want to comment on the Gulf and their potential burgeoning weapons industry? So let's turn then from the Gulf. We have a question here about Israel, and we've talked about diversifying who we sell arms to, but what about purchasing? So this person is asking, why is Israel cooperating with China on weapon technologies, and what is the U.S. position on this cooperation? Shana, I think you're up again.
I mean, the history of the Israeli arms industry is basically they'll do business with absolutely anyone, right? They do business with countries that you would typically think that they might not have good relations with themselves. I think that in Israel, whether or not the United States is concerned about their arms export activities is absolutely irrelevant. They don't care what the U.S. thinks about their arms export activities. And that's because US support for Israel in the forms of economic aid and military aid and sort of political cover in the UN and in other organizations has become so entrenched that there is no leverage anymore, right? The US does not have that leverage because the benefits that Israel gets from the United States are seen as sacrosanct and totally untouchable. So Israel coordinates and transfers arms and does sort of technology transfers and lots of forms of coordination with many states that I think people would probably find surprising. And I don't see any reason why that is going to change.
Thank you, Shana. I think we have about time for maybe 2 more questions. So if you haven't gotten your question in, it's last call at this point. So we have an interesting question here that's kind of linking the boomerang effect of American imperial foreign policy with what we're seeing domestically. And they specifically point to what happened on January 6th here in the United States, and if that was an early warning indicator. So what are your thoughts on, how this global arms race, this look of, American intervention, all around the world, what does that mean for domestic politics and what the American public, how it perceives such politics?
Let me just start off by saying that, look, I mean, both Trump and Biden ran on this idea of ending the forever wars. They might have had different notions about how to proceed with that, but they were very consistent in their support for that idea. And I think they're tapping into a reserve of war weariness and sort of, in a broader sense, disappointment with the results of the American imperial mission, if I can just say that. We don't want to be the world's policeman anymore. So, I think that this argues for kind of a major rethink in how the United States approaches its policy in the Middle East, not worldwide as well, but just to what extent do we have to be involved in the region? What extent do we need troops there? And that, of course, impacts immediately the question of what do we need to sell these countries in terms of arms and other security assistance in order to at least enable them to maintain the peace. So I think that's very much a debate that's going on right now in Washington. And you've seen quite a few articles coming out by people who specialize in the Middle East for a long time, asking, doing more with less in the Middle East. Is the Middle East even a national interest anymore? So I think that's very much going on. I mean, I'm not sure I can personally draw a connection between that and January 6th, but certainly weariness with the role that the United States is playing in the region and more broadly the world may suggest that whether you're on the right or the left, there's a certain, impulse towards retrenchment. And I don't want to say isolationism, but I just said isolationism. I don't think we'll get to that point, but there is definitely something out there politically that speaks to that.
I would just add, I mean, I think there is definite interest in examining the value of accountable security practices in both US domestic and foreign policy, and that those links are being made. And what we do abroad has direct impact on what is happening at home, and trying not to have such a, have a policy for our foreign partnerships and security alliances, and then something that looks very different at home. We've also seen, just in terms of export of weapons, we've seen weapons that have been exported abroad being used by domestic police forces here in the United States. And there's lots of controversy and conversation about that as well. And so I think it's becoming increasingly impossible to divorce sort of our discussion of what are our values and our principles as we're engaging with partners and allies abroad, and how we engage with not only our own domestic population, but what values and principles that we want to represent as a country. So I think that dialogue is ongoing, and I think there's an increasing interest in seeing resolution to that.
I'd really like to echo what Rachel said and point to the Black Lives Matter movement and the Indigenous rights movement in the US, and also the BDS movement, the domestic movement for BDS in the US, which have really, I think, done a lot to link domestic repression inside the US to the activities of US imperialism overseas, right, which has really resonated, I think, a lot with young people especially. And this new generation, I think, doesn't buy into the myth of the Pax Americana that so sort of dominated previous generations. Also because they're not benefiting from it, right, the way previous generations have, right? Baby boomers, people post World War II, there was really a boom that an economic boom that really people here really felt, and that doesn't exist anymore. And war fighting is just a drain on everyone now. And I think especially the younger generation really sees that and is starting to make those connections.
Yeah, and we'll have to keep an eye on that. I think there's a lot of developments coming forth. So we have just about 2 minutes, and I want to end with kind of next steps. So we have a question here. What do we do about this? What are the best international mechanisms to reduce arms flow? We see almost no appetite for arms embargoes. The UN seems largely ineffective on this. Is it bilateral agreements, de-escalating conflicts? How do we move forward on addressing what I think you've all done an excellent job pointing out is a huge and growing, kind of global crisis?
I mentioned it in my remarks sort of as the last point that I said, but there is an international treaty about responsible arms transfers and establishing national practices that have criteria and risk mitigation and transparency over those decisions, so that we know what is going to where, from whom, through what channels, et cetera. And that is the Arms Trade Treaty. And it is actually has tremendous support from arms exporters, far less support, believe it or not, in terms of states parties, from arms importers, though there are all many, but very little membership from the Middle East. There are some Middle East countries that are parties to the treaty or signatories to the treaty. But we have to start taking these international commitments and obligations seriously. And when we say there are criteria not to sell, when there's a risk that these weapons could be used to commit human rights abuses or violations of international humanitarian law, we have to be prepared to name and shame those countries that continue to violate both their national regulations, but also their international commitments. So there is a tool. I think, bilateral pressure is great. Regional efforts by the European Union, for example, are really important. But ultimately, arms sales are national decisions, and that's where we see varying interpretations and application of existing commitments. And so we need to see that more harmonized and standardized in accordance with existing practice.
I'd just like to add to that you know, the Cato Institute has something called the Arms Sales Risk Index, which rates countries on the basis of their riskiness as arms recipients, whether it's for corruption, human rights abuses, leakage of arms to terrorist groups or to opposition groups outside the country. Most of the Middle East falls into that category. And the study makes a point that the United States has exported to most of these countries who are in the highest risk categories with very few restrictions. So one thing I think we could do as a country is pay more attention to the risk factors involved in selling weapons to certain countries and take a broader view of that risk, not just is this military organization that we have bilateral relations with going to misuse them, but what are the broader risks in terms of human rights, in terms of corruption, in terms of destabilizing neighboring countries. I think another thing that we can do, you know, frankly, is do a better job of enforcing our own end-use restrictions and our own human rights restrictions, such as the Leahy Law, which forbids export of arms to certain foreign military units that are involved in systematic human rights abuses. I think if we pay more attention to those, and this is quite apart from installing new legislation governing arms sales, I think that in itself could make a big impact into where and how much arms that we sell to a number of different countries. That might at least be a starting point if the Biden administration wants to embark on that.
And I want to hear from both Shana and Alexandra. We have just a few minutes left, so you could just limit your comments to just about a minute, please. Thank you.
Right. I mean, one thing would be to commit more resources to monitoring and regulation, right? Because those capacities in our own government have been stripped over many generations so that there's no one to monitor the factories where these things are being produced and where it ends up. Right. And that was a very intentional, that was something that happened very intentionally because weapons firms knew what the outcome of that would be. And also would be signing on to the ICC. There has to be an enforcement mechanism, a mechanism to hold countries accountable. And if the United States refuses to sort of sign on to the one global mechanism that could actually do that, then I don't see any sort of likelihood that other countries will then hold themselves subject to those rules as well.
I just want to add that I, of course, agree with everything what was said above, but to add, in order to reduce arms flows, we need to control and monitor these arms flows. And in order to know what we are controlling and monitoring, we need to actually know exactly what is happening. So therefore, I think that we should continue to disseminate this information and analysis with regards to these issues and to continue raising awareness on the harmful impact of these arms transfers to the conflict areas and in general, just to contribute somehow to prevention of conflicts in many areas. Thank you.
Thank you all. And I'm glad we got to end on a slightly hopeful note that, you know, this seems kind of out of our control, but there are, you know, mechanisms in progress. It's just a matter of the motivation and incentive to approach them. So thank you to our audience today for joining us today, for all your questions. My apologies, we did not get to every question in time. I encourage you to follow the writing and the work of our panelists. Thank you very much to our wonderful panelists for sharing your time and insights. I personally learned a lot. I invite you all to join us on Friday for the third and final day of this conference. Day 3 will begin with keynote addresses from Joey Hood, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs at the U.S. Department of State, and Tariq Mitri, the former Special Representative and head of the United Nations Support Mission in Libya. For additional information and to register, please visit arabcenterdc.org. Thank you all and have a great afternoon.